Hello all. Today we are going to talk about medieval Europe, and I'm going to, I have up here on the board or on the slide that you're looking at, medieval feudalism. Feudalism is a bit of a troublesome concept. We're going to poke holes at it and end up saying all kinds of reasons why feudalism doesn't quite apply, and yet as a kind of package concept, we're going to start with it anyway. It sort of is this concept that just won't die. So, feudalism, political fragmentation, and the mostly agricultural economy of medieval Europe. After Charlemagne's reign, post-Carolingian Europe, and the order that Charlemagne had worked to establish in building a government didn't last too long before, again, we see the sort of fragmentation that had been rearing its head since the demise of the Roman Empire. Under his grandsons, they didn't quite hold it together. And in some ways, I'll start with a remark by a historian, Lynn Hunt, where she talks about the devolution of Roman order in what had been Roman lands and the Western Roman Empire led to a fragmentation. And that fragmentation led to a transformed economic landscape as well. So that's one of the big things that I want to do in this lecture is talk about that the political order, if you will, that resulted from that fragmentation in the political sense, and also the economic order that emerged, the socioeconomic way in which life became organized for the majority as a result of that fragmentation. So as Hunt wrote, in the countryside, now beyond the control of any central government, wealthy Romans built sprawling villas on extensive estates, staffed by tenants bound to the land like slaves. These establishments aimed to operate as self-sufficient units by producing all they needed, defending themselves against barbarian raids, and keeping their distance from any authorities. You'll recall, so in the Roman system, a government ruler that needed to, was obligated to collect taxes, and a deficit in that tax collection needed to be paid off from that leader's personal funds. We talked about the tremendous corruption in this system and how Roman servitors across the extent of the empire pocketed fortunes for themselves, including none other than that Cicero. Well, at the same time, they did have to pony up if they hadn't collected enough taxes. And as the financial problems of the 3rd century continued and became more exacerbated, it was harder and harder to turn a profit. And once it became a deficit proposition to run a province, you had less and less volunteers. So instead of stepping up for state service, they said, I'm out of here. And they started consolidating land with the wealth they had on their own latifundia and having those coloni come and do the work on them, creating a self-sufficient unit by producing what they needed, defending themselves against barbarians, and keeping their distance from any authorities. So that's sort of this picture of fragmentation that leads to a different political organization, and this term we call feudalism. Feudalism is the tyranny of a concept historians have written about. Well, one very old historian, Ganshoft, coined this term, and he coined this term to describe what he saw in France, what's now France in the 10th to 13th century. And what characterized this system was the lord-vassal relationship. And the lord-vassal relationship consisted of a vassal, subordinate man offering his loyalty to the lord. In a ceremony witnessed by others, the vassal to be would kneel and place his hands between the hands of his Lord and say, I promise to be your man. So Lord's hands on the outside, hands on the inside. I promise to be your man. And this act was known as homage, H-O-M-A-G-E. It was followed by the promise of fealty. And that fealty is fidelity, trust, service, in which the vassal swore with his hand on relics or on a Bible that he would be loyal to his lord. And then the vassal and the lord kissed. In an age when many couldn't read, this ritual, this publicly observable ritual, communicated very important information. And so the ritual was the ritual, this act of homage, was a very important key moment in establishing this institution. And so that was the kind of political act that established a relation between a lord and his vassal. That said, what did this relationship consist of? Well, this relationship consisted at its most basic level of land for service. The lord had all kinds of land, and that land we think of as a fief. The fief, it was mostly land enough to support one knight. In some cases, as time went on, it could become money or an office of a high church office or something. Hey, how about that? We'll talk about that. But the fief was what, in exchange for his loyalty and service to the Lord, the knight got to have. And then what the knight had to do was show up and serve when this lord went to war. And this was very much a warring society. Those who pray, those who work, those who fight. And so these vassals would be the armies. And it meant that the fief was what it came with people. It came with people who did the work of making food and raising animals or whatnot, and also in this sense of self-sufficiently trying to make the tack and things, so that when the knight went off to war on campaign, he doesn't just walk off with a backpack. He walks off, he has multiple animals, he's got his whole contingent serving him. It's a much more, feudal warfare is an entirely outsourced deal, and shows up to demonstrate his fealty and offer service to the Lord. And these relationships were often quite contractual, in the sense that there were so many days a year that the vassal owed the Lord service, and warfare was very much a seasonal affair. At any rate, so fealty was the vassal's promise of loyalty, fidelity, trust, service that the vassal swore to his lord. Homage is the formal ceremony in church where the agreement is made, and it always happened in a church. And it involved, this is a slightly later evolution, but the taking of hands. And investiture is that act of transferring the fief from the lord to the vassal. Of course, the land doesn't go anywhere, it's just, it becomes into the possession of the vassal. Now, sometimes the way this system evolved was that you would have a king at the top of it, and then he would have vassals that swear fealty to him, but those vassals could be big enough and they might want to fight their own wars and have a big enough collection of land that they too would get their own vassals. As you moved farther down a hierarchy, they would be knights to serve them. And this sort of a vassal of a vassal of a vassal, that process is known as sub-infeudation, and it could create future conflicts of interest that definitely came to bear in many medieval conflicts. And with sub-infeudation, you might think of it as, an adjunct instructor who's teaching a course at various different universities at the same time. And not that universities go to war with each other, but has spread loyalties. Where kind of the contest is military is military, it was something that could happen in this system. All right, so some examples of sub-infeudation, or at least this feudal world led to maps that now deserve our pause a little bit. And one example of kind of a quintessential feudal king and someone enmeshed in feudal relationships, I would put before you the example of Henry II of the Angevin dynasty. He's the king of England in the 12th century, but he's not only the king in England. On this map right here, the blue and the green are either kind of his dominion lands are the blue, and then green lands are lands dependent on England, so have some sort of feudal relations to people of that make them in some way subordinate to an English realm. And what you'll notice about this is you might look at this map and say, hey, there's England north of the Channel and there's France. But you see that the colors of England and France are kind of similar. That's a manifestation of this feudalism. Henry II of Anjou is not just the king of England. He also ends up, there's a lot of complicated backstory, but he does homage to the King Louis of France and becomes the Duke of Normandy. He also becomes the Count of Anjou and Maine. Through his marriage, he becomes the Duke of Aquitaine. Later, he'll become the Count of Nantes. So through feudal relationships, he amasses more and more territory. What you'll notice is this is not the way in which this territory is apportioned does not correspond to some idea of there are French people that are grouped in this one territory and share this culture, heritage, language, religion, etc., in a sort of ethno-national concept of geopolitical integrity. What we have here is something quite different. So pay attention, because where our course ends is we are going to be moving in that direction of having different rules for establishing geopolitical integrity. And this feudal moment, this medieval moment, isn't that. Also, I put on your radar screen Thomas Becket, because Thomas Becket and Henry of Anjou come to great conflict over church matters, sorting out this issue that has been a red thread through our course of what's the relationship between church and state, who's in charge, a secular ruler or a church ruler. And the case of Thomas Becket and Henry Anjou, without going into details, is one of those manifestations of that conflict. Here's a picture of France. On the right, this is actually modern France and its provinces that still remain. And the picture on the left is taken actually from the 14th century. And it shows just the various different designations. And still, the point I want to make to you here is there are different rulers calling different shots in different places. Here again is our maps that begin in the 14th century. And this is, I'll show you this again when we talk about the 14th century and the 100 Years' War. But the 100 Years' War, big, long-lasting war between France and England. And the thing to know is that when it starts, England, the King of England, rules over some of the territory that we now think of France. And as that war proceeds, England rules over more and more of that territory. When it ends, we'll see a polity that in the 15th century, and on the verge of the Renaissance, we see an entity that looks more like what we think of as France. And as late as the 16th century, there are still, these feudal relationships are giving way to something different, but you still have in the 16th century lords who could switch their allegiance from one lord to another. Even there are cases in the course of one single battle. And I really do mean mid-battle. Of course, that would be a betrayal of fealty at some level, but when those feudal relations got so layered and embedded that they could be hard to follow, this is what lends itself to that sort of an outcome. So this feudal relationship that I've been talking about is one in which free men swear fealty to each other, and the wealthy or more privileged men, regional authorities, perhaps during the Carolingian era, that then, as things broke down, they said, well, hey, I'll hang on to this. They became leaders, and these more privileged men secure military service and oaths of vassalage in return for the land. And that's the classic model. Throughout much of Europe, we see castles emerging, small castles to defend raiders spring up. And then we have this period of knights and armor and chivalry and courtly love. King Arthur is a very early legendary 6th century king who fought against the Saxons, and the Song of Roland, an epic poem to this hero of minor campaigns under Charlemagne. So that's sort of the beginning of that sort of order. Now, at the same time, so now we've spent some time talking about the lord-vassal relationship, and I showed you that hierarchical chart and some maps of how territory gets divvied up. And now I want to turn and I want to talk about the socioeconomic order. This is those who work. At the same time that historian Ganshoff was defining this system of feudalism, another historian, Mark Bloch, wrote a seminal two-book study, Feudal Society. And so for what Bloch did was say, I'm going to explain this world, and I'm going to take it not just in the political realm of who's ruling, who's ruling whom, who's fighting battles, but how the whole system works. And so he titled it not just feudalism, but feudal society. He's going to encompass the whole of those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. And he turns very much to the manor system. So the manor, or manorialism, is the system of the economic relationship that gets described. I actually don't have Mark Bloch's Feudal Society here, but I have another later study by George Duby, Rural Economy and Country Life in the Medieval West, which describes many of the same relationships of what we call manorialism. It's kind of the socioeconomic or the underside of the feudal system. And so in the manor, you have a village of people, peasants, that are largely disenfranchised. These are not independent yeoman farmers. Maybe they were coloni of the early latifundia days. And that could mean that they had been slaves of a certain area, or it could mean that they had been modest landowners that through debt, inflation, or whatnot, fell out of the ranks of landowners and then set themselves up as essentially tenant farmers. And so in the manorial system, again, kind of in talking about it, I'm going back to that same point of departure of a centralized government giving way to a more fragmented world where services aren't delivered or given, and people establish a kind of self-sufficiency about them. These self-sufficient units are the manor. And so one of the most important thing to do in the pre-modern world is make food. So mostly it's peasants who are farming, and they live in a village all together. So on this map, you see, the village would be centered. Of course, there'd be a church, and then they would go out to their fields. This is a time in which a 3-field system in which they're rotating where they are planting things at a certain time, so as to let fields laying fallow, that means nothing's planted in them, have a little bit of nutrient recovery, and that way go longer without exhausting the soil. So the farming takes up the vast majority of the manor, but there's a whole bunch of other important stuff that's going on. So you need to have, there's gardens, and then there's going to be a blacksmith shop and a mill and a oven press and all the things, all the little artisanry and crafts that are necessary, from making horseshoes to plows to leather straps to clothes, to weaving to candles, that need to happen for life to go forward. So this is a period of self-sufficiency. Trade had been, and Northern Europe, I don't want to exaggerate, kind of Northern Europe, where we're moving our conversation to was never the Mediterranean in terms of trade or whatnot. But what trade may have existed in the Roman Empire devolves on the territory of Europe from the 7th, so from the 600s to the 1200s, there are no gold coins minted. There used to be, but now all that gold is going towards the trade that is continuing in the Eastern Roman Empire, in the Arab world, under the Abbasids. That's where gold is going, and none of it is really making its way up to Europe. Maybe some coins get there, but no one in Europe is minting gold coins for several centuries. And here's an image of the gold florin that gets minted in the mid 13th century in Florence, down in Italy. And now we can look back and say, oh, that's a signal of something happening, something good happening in an economic sense for Europe. And so here's back to these lords and peasants on the manor. So the mass of agricultural labor is not under the authority of any central state, but these local landlords. And the peasants that work on them, they don't have recourse to some state to go to court or whatnot. The lord becomes the state. The lord, the bailiff, maybe polices if peasants get in an argument between each other. Someone stole something from me or hurt me. It's the lord who delivers justice and sets up courts. Churches will also have their own courts for their own crimes, but there isn't really much of a big central government. Even as central government will start to emerge, that is really for serious crimes among people that have access to the king. So the little people don't have access to any sort of centralized state justice. It's something that happens at the level of the manor. Now, so what does it mean to be a peasant in this world? You're not a slave, but you're not an entirely free person either. You can't just leave the land, and you're obligated to work that land. And you split your days where you spend some days working to feed yourself and your family and do whatever you need for your family to survive. And then you spend other days where you work on the landlord's fields to supply him. And remember, he's not working. He and a whole contingent of the knight, for example, are not outworking the fields to grow food. They need to be fed, and they take the stores off to do battle, etc. So manorialism is the term used to describe the local manor-based agricultural economy of the period. When we talk about manorialism, we're talking about the lord-serf relationship. And the key here is land for work. If between lord and vassal, the key relationship is land for service. Between lord and peasant, the key relationship is land for work, and kind of land for military service. Between the lord-vassal and the lord-serf relationship, land for work. And that is the word serf or villain. These are these are the words for peasants. They're not entirely free peasants. They are bound to the land in a dependent, obligatory relationship. It's an example of power devolving into the hands of local elite, and how that plays out at the bottom of the social scale. So, and here we have lots of diagrams of that feudal hierarchy, that there is a king, and then there are vassals or castellans. Here's a church person, and we're gonna work that just a little bit into this model that isn't as neat as I'm even describing it here. But this could be an archbishop and someone that oversees a monastery or their own large fiefdom. And then we have knights. They're lower than castellans, fighting wars, and high enough to have their own serfs doing the work to feed them underneath them. And so this is that theoretical picture of the feudal hierarchy in a society where there's three orders. The King Alfred of England wrote at one point, "A well-peopled land must have men of prayer, men of war, and men of work." And that idea became the three orders, that in a society there will be those who pray, the clergy, those who fight, the nobility, and entertaining the lords and ladies, and those who work, the peasants. So you might be saying, what's in it for the peasants? Why stay and work? Well, what's in it for the peasants in a world where there could be raids of barbarian armies? And what do barbarian armies want? Slaves are pretty lucrative. Not everywhere, I'm generalizing here, but certainly along the bounds of the steppe forest frontier, not so much what we see in Central Europe, but that could happen too. But in the part of the world I study most, down on that steppe frontier, not so much barbarians, but nomads would raid villages and take slaves and send them down to Ottoman trading posts to be sold into slaves, or whether they ended up in a harem or as a eunuch or as a rower in some galley going across the Mediterranean. A life of slavery awaited. And so, but there were security concerns, and maybe barbarian attacks aren't even, it depended, covering so much ground, but would still kill and pillage and rape and take hostages. And so in times of any sort of attack, one would want to go inside the Lord's castle. And this is where castles, now we kind of think of them as luxurious entities, and they did become that, but they were also very much defensive structures that tended to have a wall around them and be built in a place hopefully easily defensible or well fortified. And in times of attack, this is where the peasants could go inside the castle walls to fight and or wait out the siege. So this, if you ever, maybe you have been or will go to Europe, look up some castles and visit them, and there's just a whole visual world to be to kind of inspire thinking about history. For me, I remember my high school history teacher, Fran de Bishop, showing us pictures and pictures of castles. So here we are going to just take some quick looks at some castles, some medieval castles. This one is up in Wales, the high northern reaches of Europe. This one is all the way in Eastern Europe, in Slovenia. And you see how it's built into this cliffside. That's strategic, right? It's hard to attack a cliff. I am climbing up, rappelling down. I don't think that much of that happened. So you have quite a defensible position here. Here's another castle in Romania associated with Vlad the Impaler. And you'll see here, again, there's a moat around it. There's this one way in on this bridge that would be, you would often have elaborate gates. Small windows were typical of castles where you could shoot an arrow out and they would be angled sort of like this, so you could get perspective this way and get perspective this way, but you didn't have a big window where, so there was less area. Someone had to be a really good shot to get you. So there's all kinds of features of medieval castles that are very, now we look at them as charming. Now we look at them as charming, but they're actually, and so here there's many features that we take as charming that have quite practical defensive type intentions, including sometimes there was 2 layers between that initial entrance and outside, and that maybe attackers would be trapped in them and hot oil would be poured over invaders. Sometimes frozen water was used to the advantage on the sloped surfaces, and all kinds of methods were worked out for the defense of those in the castle. Windsor Castle, now a site of utter luxury for the English monarchy, was built in the 11th century by William the Conqueror as a defensive castle. So there was both, it was where the Lord stayed, and it was also had a defensive function. And keep in mind, lords, the world isn't as territorially fixed, we might say, the political world, as we think of it now. Lords and even kings would often, they wouldn't stay in one place throughout the year. They would move to keep tabs on their realm, to eat food from various estates so that they could kind of live in the style, in the higher style to which they were accustomed to, because it's a land pre-refrigeration, of course. And so even government was a much more transitory, mobile endeavor in the medieval world. Charlemagne himself spent a lot of time, he built this court at Aachen, but he traveled around his realm. Here is a famous castle in France. Here in Germany is the Marksburg Castle, and there are just castles and castles. And I have put here, you can Google it, medievalist.net, and they have lots of castles throughout German lands. So that, in a nutshell, again, our feudal model. There is, however, there's been a whole lot, as I said in the beginning, of historians that have pushed back on this feudal model. So, and really taken issue with describing the medieval world in this way. So what's wrong with this model of feudalism? Well, much of the evidence comes from ecclesiastical or royal manors. It's a pretty confined set of evidence. And there's this sense, okay, maybe this is what is happening in France, in much of what's now France in the 10th century, but what about the rest of Europe? What is everyone else doing? And there are alternative models for organizing society, or where people get justice. You have horizontal bonds among some aristocrats. Monasteries, we talked about monasteries, are these sites where people will go. And the church does have its own courts and develops a body of canon law that is substantial. There are some people organize themselves according to relic cults and prayer confraternities. We'll talk about the Begins. And so basically what I might say to you is feudalism is not the whole story. That maybe if it exists, it just is applicable to part of France in the 10th century. And even where feudal relations do exist, there are variations. The feudal networks in France were significantly more elaborate, hierarchical, and complicated than those in Anglo-Saxon England, for example, which had never been part of the Carolingian Empire. France had its own twist, as great lords created feudal relations with high-ranking churchmen and abbots and bishops. We'll talk more about the particularities of these German lands because they play a role in how the Reformation plays out. And then German towns along the Baltic coast also developed a trading network. They developed a trading network that reached from Denmark to Sweden into Novgorod in what's now Russia. And this was ruled by a cartel known as the Hanseatic League. Sometimes lords or kings didn't just do homage with the heads of manors, but with towns. That were centers of trade and kind of permanent thriving centers of trade. And between burghers and those municipalities, there would be different types of relationships. So feudalism is not the only game in town. And also historians have pointed out, there are places in Europe where the public authority didn't devolve. And that kings did have more authority. So that's another kind of complicating issue regarding just seeing everything as this fragmented world of lords and vassals, without really countries. And even that very question, did nations exist? Well, some people, such like is in this book, Fiefs and Vassals by the historian Susan Reynolds, they think that the idea of nation was worth more than some historians have given credit for, and wants to say, well, it does. There are some ideas. Now, getting at this, and ideas of nation involves, necessarily points towards questions that have to do with identity. And questions of identity, by definition, if you'll forgive me a tautology, they require understanding identities, right? That means, how did people think of themselves? And here we quickly run into the problems. As with everything, it's harder to learn about what people who didn't really write things down thought and felt. And also that people have multiple identities. If I were to, say, who are you? How you would answer that question is going to depend on who's asking it. Is it your friend? Is it your relative? Is it a customs agent at a foreign country on the other side of the world? Or is it kind of a high school coach? By the same token, as a historian, someone who thinks about sources, if I would certainly gain more insight into who you are if I were to look, say, at your high school yearbook than if I were to look at your passport. And this is all just to say that we can discuss identity construction in all sorts of complex ways, but if we're asking questions that require a sense of identity to answer them, then historians want to be clear on the types of sources that they're using. That is, they want to have a good sense, a solid, and we say critical understanding of the possibilities and limits of their sources, what a source can tell us, what a source can't tell us. And so keep that in mind as you work on your papers coming up, dealing with primary sources. If St. Augustine of Hippo, writing in his, fancy scriptoria, or some other high-ranking ecclesiastic, highly educated cleric, is writing something about how, a serf woman feels, to what extent do we trust that perspective? Right, that's kind of at the basic of kind of at the nitty-gritty ground level of what we're always doing in history. We're trying to explain change over time, say true things about the past using sources, and recognizing that those sources are always coming from a perspective. They'll tell us some things, but they won't necessarily tell us everything or what we want to know from them. We need to know how to read sources. That's what it means. That is what it means to approach your sources critically. So, and I just kind of leave with that general lesson about the business of doing history on this question of feudalism, between, whether it was all political fragmentation, whether there are some latent ideas about nation belonging, and the process of how we go from an order of a more fragmented order towards an order of stronger central governments. In our early modern period, we'll talk about a period of state building, the kind of beginning process that maybe James Baldwin, dealing very much with French medieval power, talks about, in the government of Philip Augustus, foundations of French royal power in the Middle Ages. I just kind of put these books up as a show and tell to just lightly signal that in this really general lecture, there is a massive, interesting, and rich scholarly literature taking up these questions. So come to me in drop-in hours if you want to learn more, read more, and pursue these questions farther. But otherwise, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.